Okay. Hello, everyone. Apologies, just a minute. Hello, and a warm welcome to everyone on today's session. I would like to thank you dearly for joining. This is the Aligning Reporting Best Practices session as part of Climate Bond's annual conference, the second one we've held virtually. I hope everyone is well and keeping safe. And I'm very excited to be running this first training session we're holding on reporting. My name is Miguel Almeida. I'm a research manager at the Climate Bonds Initiative. And I've been doing research and analysis of the sustainable finance market for 3 years here. My role is now increasingly focused on the topic of reporting, having recently managed and been the lead author of our post-issuance reports in the green bond markets, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. This is there, but finally, a word of thank you to our sponsors. So we've got quite a few, which is great to see. JP Morgan, Credit Suisse, Ping An, Moody's ESG Solutions, Luxembourg Green Exchange, Citibank, Refinitiv, BNP Paribas, IHS Markets, Alliance Bernstein, FSD Africa, UK AIDS, IDB, ICMA, Mizuho, IFC, and Ashurst. So thank you very much. It would not be possible to run the conference without your support. Few housekeeping notes. So please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. You will see that in the app. You can also reach out to myself via email after the session, and I'll share my email later on. Also, other thoughts and comments about our conference, you can address that via the chat box. We have live interpretation available in 4 languages, and all sessions are being recorded and will be available on the app until November. Please also make use of the various tools that Swapcard has to offer, and you can network with thousands of attendees, etc. And for members of the media, please get in touch with our comms team via the Climate Bonds virtual booth, including for any interview requests. Also, a few notes about our disclaimer. Just clarifying that the presentation will be shared after, but it is confidential, only intended for the audience. So please do not share it with third parties without our consent. And also, the information contained does not constitute investment advice in any form, and the Climate Bonds Initiative is not an investment advisor. I know the presentations from other speakers also contain disclaimers, so have a look at those. Right. Before I cover the agenda of today's session and introduce our amazing speakers, let's go over a short intro to make sure we're all, on the same page and some basics are covered. And I'll also give a bit of context on the work we've been doing as Climate Bonds Initiative. So firstly, what do we mean by reporting in the green bond market? It's actually relatively simple. So we're essentially talking about disclosure on the use of proceeds and impacts of the projects that are financed. Usually this reporting is only really at the post-issuance stage, but complementary info can and often exists at issuance. The key exception there is when a bond is fully refinancing assets, and so there may not be a need to provide allocations reporting post-issuance, but it is still best practice to provide some form of reporting, especially in terms of impacts. And then also, why is reporting important? It may be obvious to many of you, but mainly because it adds transparency and credibility in the market, and especially when the market exists to generate environmental and social benefits, right? So it's especially important in this case, and in the case of use of proceeds instruments which are financing specific projects and assets. So what do we do as Climate Bonds Initiative? Our work for quite a few years has been centered on a periodic study of reporting in the green bond market, which is, as you can imagine, a very resource and time-intensive process of going through all the publicly available information on each bond's use of proceeds and impacts. Our latest report, called Post-Issuance Reporting in the Green Bond Market 2021, was launched in May. And there we covered a research universe of about 700 bonds from over 400 issuers, totaling 212 billion issued. And I note that this covers green bonds only. So we actually haven't started looking at reporting for social and sustainability bonds yet, which is a much less evolved space, of course. And so the session today will also be focused on green bonds, so keep this in mind. But a lot of the info will be relevant for other sustainable debt instruments. Our study aims to be a comprehensive analysis of post-issuance reporting in the green bond market and is intended to generate useful information for a range of market participants. It has several specific objectives, which I listed here on the slide. So the first one is really to understand the availability of reporting in the markets and how that varies by region, issuer type, etc. Also to assess the attributes of reporting, so how issuers are actually reporting, and there we look at the overall quality of reporting as well as specifically impact reporting practices. We also try and provide best practice recommendations and then summarize the trends or the status quo of reporting and identify development areas. There is also other supporting information like a glossary of key terms that maybe some of the audience will find useful. I don't have time to cover this here, but do have a look at this if you're interested, along with the rest of the report when you get a chance. In terms of findings, I'd like to first ask the audience. So we've got a little polling question ready for you, which should be appearing in the poll section now. So the question is, in terms of reporting in the green bond markets, what do you think the priority is to increase the availability of reporting, to increase the quality of reporting, or to make reporting more consistent? So it's three areas which could be focus areas for the market. So if you write down some of your answers now, I'd be very interested to see them. I actually won't be able to because I'm sharing my screen, but I'll have a look after, and I'm sure it'll be useful information. I should mention that it's a relatively simplistic way to ask this question because the three aims are interrelated, but there are one or two clear winners from our work. I'll just give a few more seconds for people to have a chance to answer. Okay, so from our perspective, it's really the last two that are the priorities. So increasing the quality of reporting as well as making reporting more consistent should be the goals, and especially this last one, because we want more consistency of good reporting, of course, not bad reporting. But the key point is that the availability of reporting is not as much an issue anymore. We have almost all of the issuers in the market are reporting. There are, of course, still improvements there. Not all of them are, and many issuers especially do not report in the most timely of ways. But this to say that the availability of reporting is not really the key issue in the market. And so today I will not really be covering the results of that analysis. I'll be focusing on how to improve the way issuers report, providing best practice recommendations, and then how to make this more harmonized in the markets. And that's the context for our work. So I'd just like to share that a little bit with you first. We are now centered on driving better reporting in the markets and supporting standardization of high quality reporting. And that's also the aim of today's session, i.e. to provide clarity on what good reporting is, which is especially useful for issuers, but also the range of other market participants. And so that's also the structure of today's session. Right, so we have a packed agenda. 2 hours may feel like quite a lot of time, but I'm sure it'll fly by given everything we want to cover and the range of great speakers we have. So I will be presenting first. We've already covered the intro and context. And next, I'll focus on explaining what good reporting is from both an overall market perspective as well as from our work at Climate Bonds Initiative. And this will include an overview of existing efforts to harmonize reporting, as well as going over our best practice recommendations, giving an overview of our quality scoring analysis, and finally also some comments on case studies and best practice examples. We then have a range of speakers. So firstly, for Karoliina, Kajova, who's a senior funding manager at MuniFin, will be presenting their experience with reporting. They are a very high quality reporting issuer. This will be followed by sharing of two experiences from the investor side. So firstly, we've got Daniel Kricheff, a partner at Affirmative Investment Management, or AIM, who will be talking about mainly their approach to using data that is reported by issuers and coming up with impact reporting themselves. Followed by Isobel Edwards, Green Bond Analyst at NN Investment Partners, NNIP, So she will be focusing on EU taxonomy alignments and the kind of information issuers can make available to support investors with that site, and also the links to the EU Green Bond Standard, of course. And then we've got two platforms. So very exciting also to have Cecilia Repinski, CEO of Green Assets Wallet, sharing the tool they have developed, which has been around for a few years, and then Alexander Vasa, senior financial specialist at the IADB, who's been leading a lot of the work from the IADB on the Green Bond Transparency platform, which is another platform focused on LATAM. And in terms of Q&A, so the Q&A formats, we will be answering the questions as much as possible in the chat, but some will also be fed to myself and other speakers. As we go along, you can see that we have a Q&A section after each section of the presentation. So we've got 4 there. And we will also have another polling question for the audience, so watch out for it. Right. Let's move on. So firstly, I'd like to cover an overview of existing efforts to improve and harmonize reporting. So let's start with a macro view of reporting in the green bond market. Currently, we have a market with the vast majority of issuers reporting in a relatively timely fashion, but crucially with understandardized reporting practices. That's the key feature. And at the core of this lack of standardization is driven by the fragmented nature of reporting up to now, right? So in the absence of a common framework and a format to report within, we've had issuers independently planning, creating, and publishing green bond reports, and this has created a lack of consistency, which poses problems, especially in the impacts space. So it's a more complex space than UOP reporting, and where if the data is not comparable, cannot be aggregated reliably, it prevents impact assessment on the part of investors when looking at multiple securities or issuers. So that's the key issue, and overall there is a clear need then to improve and harmonize reporting in the green and even sustainable debt markets. This slide summarizes the existing work to this end. So there are various efforts globally, as you can see, and there is some overlap between them, but mainly they fall into 2 groups, I would say. So the first one is frameworks and guidance you have on the left. There's quite a few examples. The green bond principles, which everyone is familiar with, are the broadest set of guidance, and reporting is one of its 4 key components. But beyond that, there is little specific guidance within the principles on how and what to report. Within the guidance that is more targeted at reporting, there is more focus on how to disclose impacts, given this is the most complex part of reporting. And the more comprehensive and adopted piece is the handbook, Harmonized Framework for Impact Reporting, which I'll be referring to as the Harmonized Framework. And that's published by ICMA. It's refined continuously. And ICMA has actually set up an impact reporting working group, which we're also part of and has many members. And this working group has been instrumental in developing the Harmonized Framework over the last few years. The framework itself includes broad as well as sector-specific recommendations, including suggested metrics in each project category with templates to help issuers with how to format reports, especially on the impact side. Another pertinent example of a framework is the guidance under the NPSI position paper, Nordic Public Sector Issuers position paper on green bond impact reporting. So this actually targets public sector issuers from the Nordics, as the name implies, but it can be applied in other contexts. So, there are actually a few issuers from around the world who reference it, and it can be useful elsewhere. And it's actually quite similar in scope and recommendations to the Harmonized Framework. These two, the Harmonized Framework and the NPSI position paper, are the most common in the market, but they do still represent quite a small share. So it would be great to see issuers using them more. I won't go into more detail on them, as you can check the documents directly. Another key initiative is the EU Green Bond Standards. At the moment, this is still a proposed and voluntary standard. It is more for the EU, but it can be used by any issuer. And it already includes some recommendations and templates to report that are largely in line with the Harmonized Framework, albeit with a bit less detail. I believe Isobel will cover this in a bit more detail later on. But I would like to add that from our perspective, once it becomes commonly used in the market, I do think the Green Bond Standard can really help to drive better and more harmonized reporting in the markets. And I do hope there are people from the European Commission also listening in that may also be interested to work together. Then we've got ourselves. So we as Climate Bonds Initiative, we've also provided some recommendations over the years, and I'll go over them in the next couple slides. And then there are other types of guidance. So we've got, for example, country and sector-specific guidance and other methodologies. In terms of methodologies, for example, we highlight many in our reports that are focused on impacts and referenced by issuers, but also almost all of them are not specific to green bonds or green bond projects, right? So these are more general guides, methodologies to reporting or calculating impacts in general. Now, these can, of course, be used, and they may even be more useful in certain contexts than the other more focused frameworks that I've mentioned. But ideally, it would be good to see issuers use green bond-specific frameworks and guidance as much as possible. And finally, in some countries and in some exchanges, there are also policies and guidance specifically related to green finance. And I think from what I've seen, these generally adopt the green bond principle recommendations in terms of having to provide reporting or suggesting it. But from my knowledge, there is also little in terms of providing specific recommendations on how to provide that reporting. But it is still useful for issuers to check local resources. So moving on, we've got platforms, or the second group. Platforms really are able to centralize reporting under a common framework, a common format, rather, and make this easily accessible and usable. They can be really powerful tools, and I'm very clear that the role will only become more important in the years to come. And there are 4 key ones that I've listed here, which are available in the market right now. So the Green Assets Wallet, which is a global platform and has been around for a few years, as well as the Green Bond Transparency Platform, which was developed by the IADB for LATAM specifically, and was officially launched a few months ago. We'll have presentations from both of them, of course. The 2 other most relevant ones are the NASDAQ Sustainable Bond Network, which was also recently launched, as well as the LGX Data Hub. Now, it's also important to kind of note that mostly these platforms provide data that is input by issuers and potentially external reviewers on the platform itself, but there is also the approach of collecting data reported by issuers and then making that available. And that's actually the approach of the LGX Data Hub. And I believe that the NASDAQ Sustainable Bond Network has both elements, actually. Another group that I've included here that could be added in theory, but as you can see as blank, is regulation. So this would essentially involve mandatory reporting and potentially more formalized or even mandatory guidance on how to report. As of now, there is no regulation per se on green bond reporting specifically. I think that's probably largely due to the green bond principles, which have been very effective at driving already the existence of that reporting in the market, and a reporting which has now become a de facto requirement. So maybe there's no need for mandatory rules. But the EU Green Bond Standard, of course, requires reporting, but as a currently voluntary standards, I have not included it under regulation. But yeah, it's also a good example of broader regulation affecting green bond reporting, because the GBS requires that issuers confirm alignment with the EU taxonomy, for example. So anyway, where does this all leave us? There is more guidance now than ever before, but most issuers are still not using it, especially smaller ones from emerging markets. And I think there the issue is also a lack of knowledge. But as you can tell, there is also not a unified piece that is adopted market-wide. So where does this leave us? Where will we go? I think the key to understand is the goal. The goal is to have a common language to reports and to assess impact performance, especially. And that involves a common reporting framework and format that is able to deliver consistent, comprehensive, high-quality reporting. And also that will make the life of issuers easier, as it should be, as well as for investors and even the general public, because to a large extent, the aim of the market is to deliver public goods, right? And I think it's okay to include the information on the use of proceeds and impacts as a part of that. And above all, to achieve that, we'll need collaboration between various market players. I think the intersection of a common framework, which kind of already exists, just needs to be more formalized, combined with the rising power of platforms will be the key to achieve this, and will be supported by the emergence of the EU Green Bond Standard too within the market. And so as Climate Bonds Initiative, we really want to contribute to this, and we're expanding conversations with various key stakeholders. Right. So There are a few ongoing efforts to harmonize reporting. That's clear, but harmonization towards what? I think the key is that existing guidance and work done by the platforms is very useful. We've also tried to provide specific best practice recommendations, which I'll share now. But overall, the guidance is very much in line. So there are no really significant differences from what I've seen between pieces of guidance. I should mention also that there is, of course, a steep learning curve for issuers. So in terms of providing good reporting, repeat issuers do find that process easier over time, and especially after their first bond. And in addition, larger issuers tend to have more resources to dedicate to high quality reporting, but all issuers can and should aim to report well is also the key. And in fact, in many ways, smaller issuers actually have an advantage. They might find it easier because they may only have issued one bond, or they've only issued just financed one project or one project type, which makes the process easier. So on this slide, this is meant to be a succinct list of key recommendations, but they do cover the majority of best practice. And if you're following this, then your reporting will be pretty high quality as an issuer. On the next slide, I'll cover various things that are specific to impacts. First one, communicating reporting commitments, i.e. what you will report, whether it's use of proceeds and impacts or just one. Well, you definitely need to do use of proceeds, but whether or not you do impacts is really the question. And then also where the reports will be available, and doing so clearly at issuance. So green bond frameworks and second party opinions tend to have this information available, but the location is often not disclosed. So that's an area of improvement, I would say. Then the idea is also to report in line with these commitments, right? So if you say you will report use of proceeds and impacts, then do so. However, if you committed to use of proceeds only, for example, and then you realize you can also provide impacts, of course, include those too. Another recommendation is having a dedicated green bond web page with all the relevant material. So here the key is to provide clear and easily accessible information. Having also clear descriptions and links for the documents is really useful. And then in terms of reports, either a standalone green bond report that's focused on your green finance activities, and there you can have both use of proceeds and impacts combined into a single report, or you could have two separate documents. And the alternative is to have clearly designated sections within annual or sustainability or CSR reports. And so, as long as it's clear where that information is and it's differentiated from the rest of those reports, then that makes it much easier to access. Another important point is to provide timely reports. So ideally, these will be within 1 year of issuance or soon after is generally what's recommended. And then annually. So annual reporting is by far the most common and recommended. As a general rule, there should also be reporting for as long as the bonds are outstanding, as a general rule in terms of the minimum, but specifically on allocations, it should generally be until the proceeds are fully allocated, and on impacts as long as the bond is outstanding or during the lifetime of project's assets is recommended. The key, however, is that issuers are clear about relevant time periods and what the overall status of proceeds or impacts is. So, after the first report that you've published, saying X has been allocated cumulatively, and also defining what the impacts are as of that date and what period they refer to is really positive. A general comment also to provide granular information. So one of the key ways in which this can be done is to provide bond level as well as project level information. I would say actually project level is more important. From conversations I've had, I get the sense that many investors don't actually mind receiving data from multiple bonds at once, but we tend to see more granularity as a positive where possible. So, that's also factored into our recommendations. And in terms of providing project level information, this means giving individual project details as well as use of proceeds and impacts by project where possible. And it also applies to the relevant information that I'll cover in a moment. But it would also be good to see issuers providing summary figures at category or total bond level. So that means aggregating between projects to get the overall view of the bond, or for each category that's financed. That's also good, at least for the data that can be aggregated. And then we've got clarify or explain other relevant information. So this can include things like shares of refinancing. There is no specific limit on the share of refinancing that's allowed, but for financial corporates, at least, it's generally best practice to limit that at 50%, whereas it's more flexible for other issuers. Another aspect is the share of financing to the project or asset that is from the green bond or green bonds themselves. So this is in terms of if there are multiple sources of financing, you should clarify that. And that's especially important for impact reporting. I'll mention it in the next slide. Then we've also got information on the balance of unallocated proceeds, for example, and then generally relevant time periods. So clarifying when the report was published, what period it covers, what is the use of proceeds that impacts referring to in terms of time, and also the projects, when were they constructed, when were they operated. It's actually, I would say, it's one of the main things that should be available that's generally not, is this clarification of time periods that could be clearer in the market. And then there are a couple more things like external reviews that I've listed here. Add in post-issuance, ideally, there will be external reviews. In terms of post-issuance, the best one we would consider is audits or assurance, which typically cover use of proceeds but can include impacts. And you could also engage an external consultant, for example, to help and add credibility to impact reporting. Another one is the climate bond certification scheme. There'll be a session after this on this topic. And that's a scheme that adds, again, credibility and helps ensure good practice, including on reporting. So have a look on our website and get in touch with our certification team if you want to find out more there. And finally, language. So trying to provide English copies of the documents along with any other languages is obviously a big plus. In terms of other recommendations, many of these probably didn't used to be as important a few years ago, but they are increasingly. One is to aim for consistency, striving to maintain a consistent location of information, as well as presentation format and coverage is helpful. When you're looking at various reports over time, it's good to kind of know where things will be and what they mean. But obviously, look to improve over time too. If there are things you feel you can improve, more detail you can give than anticipated, do so. Another one, which is pretty basic, is to include the details of bonds issued on the webpage and those that are covered in each green bond reports. Often we find that this is actually not made available, so it's good to clarify that, obviously, for repeat issuers. And then offering the ability to export or download data. Again, one that's becoming a little bit more common, but still not covering the majority of the market for sure. Providing qualitative information and context alongside quantitative data. So this is kind of in terms of contextualizing projects, providing more robust impacts than just a number in a table. To this end, case studies are quite useful, especially when many projects are financed, and it's a bit hard to provide detail on each. Increasingly, it is also common, or more common, again, still a minority of the market, but it is more common and expected to see issuers explaining their sustainability strategy and the fit of their sustainable finance activities within that strategy, as well as supporting information like SDG contributions, EU taxonomy information, which is still rare but becoming, again, more common, especially among the larger European issuers, and definitely a big plus to include this. Again, I'm sure Isobel will nail this point down. And then mentioning things like climate-related risks and opportunities and others. So mentioning things like TCFD disclosure is also helpful. And all of these, I should mention, are actually now recommended under the latest edition of the Green Bond Principles and the Harmonized framework. So I recommend definitely taking note of this. And a couple more things. So providing relative contact details, again, pretty basic, but not always found. And then finally, a note to consider reporting through platforms. So platforms really have the ability to make issuer life easier. They mostly already integrate all of the recommended best practice, and they also make the life of investors easier. So they're generally very helpful, and it's where the market is going. So you might as well get used to it and consider reporting through those platforms is helpful too. Right. Those were kind of more general recommendations. Let's go through some impact specific ones. So first one, I mean, I realize this slide is a bit busy, but I'll try and go through them all. I should note that our report has more detail on this. But I do think it's important to kind of understand a little bit how impact reporting can vary and what the best practice is. So firstly, definitely try and check existing guidance. That's pretty obvious. The key ones are definitely the Harmonized framework and the NPSI position paper. If you're following the recommendations there, you're already doing very well. In terms of metrics, including at least one, ideally more commonly used metrics for each project type, right? So the Harmonized framework, again, and NPSI position paper have suggested metrics depending on the project type. They're very useful. In our study, we also make an important distinction between absolute and relative metrics, which maybe not as many people are familiar with. We essentially define relative metrics as those that are a comparison against a baseline or a threshold of some sort. So things like energy saved, water saved, greenhouse gas emissions avoided would all be relative metrics. Absolute metrics do not depend on a baseline. So there'll be things like energy consumed or energy used or energy generated, greenhouse gas emissions, so the footprint also would be another one, water treated, etc. Now, from the point of view of really measuring and understanding impacts on the planet, i.e. from a scientific standpoint, absolute metrics are actually better because they inform the real impact on the world. So we really encourage issuers to report according to those. And that may be as an intensity. It could be, for example, greenhouse gas emissions or energy use per meter squared of building, for example. Now, this is not to say that relative metrics aren't useful, especially in the short term, I think, where absolute measures of performance may be harder to contextualize, including for investors. But I think issuers should try to report absolute metrics along any relative ones as much as possible. And actually, the majority don't. So if you're saying, let's say, water saved or energy saved, then also giving an indication of what the actual water use was in different time periods or what the energy use was. And also for relative metrics, try to use consistent baselines or benchmarks as much as possible. There may be good reasons not to. For example, if you have projects in different regions, you may be using different baselines because of that. But as long as these are defined clearly is also the key. In terms of units, use at least one common unit per metric. So, for energy generated, for example, megawatt hours or gigawatt hours, CO2 equivalent tons for greenhouse gas emissions, or at least to provide conversion factors. The reason I say this is because although relatively rare, you still get some issuers using very specific units without a conversion factor to more common ones, or using things like greenhouse gas emissions avoided in terms of cars taken off the road or things like that. Also a note to report in absolute units alongside any percentages. So if you're reporting energy saved, give the kilowatt hours or megawatt hours equivalent rather than just the percentage. And in terms of reporting intensities, it's also often helpful to accompany that by the total impact. So if you're saying energy saved per meter squared of building, also giving an indication of the total number of meter squares in the building to get the total impact is helpful. And likewise, as covered in the previous slides, again, providing project level impact as much as possible is great. It is good, of course, to also provide summary impacts at the category or total bond level, but you should note that relative metrics, you may not be able to aggregate them because of the differences in baselines. So there may be a difference in how greenhouse gas emissions, for example, are calculated for different projects, which means if you add them up, it's actually not correct. But issuers can kind of get around this by just being very clear about what their methodology was and caveating that the aggregate figure is dependent on that. Link to this, explaining methodologies. So the key again is to define, especially for metrics, what the meaning of the metrics are and how the impacts are calculated. You should, of course, reference any external methodologies that were used, along with how they were applied, and also include any external data sources used. I should note that several issuers include that as an appendix within the report or even as a separate document, but as long as it's clearly referenced and explained, that's what matters. And a couple of final things, differentiating between actual, i.e. ex post impacts versus expected ex ante ones is helpful. It is best practice to conduct ex post assessments where possible to support ex ante estimates. And lastly, to report the correct prorated share of impact where relevant. So if you have multiple sources of financing, it is best practice to only report impacts, of course, for the share that's attributable to the green bonds, because the impacts are referring to the green bond itself. Otherwise, they're overrepresented. Okay, I'll try and cover this relatively quickly. We've got, we've provided best practice recommendations for a while, and these have developed and expanded since our first report in 2017. These reflect our views of what good or high quality reporting is, but we also look at doing a quantitative analysis of the quality of reporting in the market. And so we've formalized a quality scoring analysis, which ranks each bond out of 25 points. We've made some adjustments in 2021, and we'll continue to do so over the years. And it's not meant to be an in-depth analysis. It's more to give an overview or to provide an indicator based on key aspects of reporting for each issuer. And of course, many of our best practice recommendations are directly linked to these criteria. So very quickly, this is the overview of the results from our latest study. You can see that there's quite a wide range. So on the bottom, you've got the quality score, the points that were achieved. And then you've got the bars referred to amount issued and the dots to the number of issuers achieving those points. You can see that most of the issuers are at the right end, so providing quite good reporting, but there is still a range, and that's the key. I'm not really going to go into more detail. Our report has more detail, including also a breakdown by region and deal size that you can look at. Okay, we've got another polling question here. So this is again related to our scoring model, and the question is, what do you think are the key general aspects or principles that drive good reporting? So this is an open-ended question. Interesting to see what people say again. Also, I should note that this is from our perspective, right? There's no mathematical right or wrong answer here. This is given our perspective and the methodology we've employed. What are the key aspects or principles that do drive good reporting? On general terms, and if you're paying attention to the previous slides on the best practice recommendations, that already provides some helpful clues on this. Okay. All right, so there's three key ones. The first one is clarity or accessibility. Clarity and accessibility, not quite the same things. But this is really about making sure the information and the definitions are clearly explained, that the disclosure is clearly laid out and easily accessible, and that in general, it's quite easy to obtain the information and to understand what it means. The second one is granularity. So this is about providing a good amount of detail in terms of what's reported. For example, providing disclosure for individual bonds and individual projects or assets, and then making sure the information is reliable. This is also important to avoid greenwashing and add credibility to what is being reported, of course. Very quickly, there is an overview of our scoring model and process, which is explained in our last two reports. So I'm not really going to go into detail here, but we have received questions from different types of organization looking to provide more detail or to obtain more detail on our methodology. So this is basically what we have. We have the three key aspects or principles that I just covered, with almost all criteria falling within these. And so these cover 18 out of the maximum 25 points, essentially, that we attribute. Again, you can see that they're relatively basic things. We didn't go into super amount of detail, and I'm not going to cover each one because, well, I'd love to, but we don't really have time for it. But it will be available in the presentation, and do let us know if you have any questions or want to obtain more detail on these. And then the other aspect, so I mentioned that those three areas aspects cover 18 out of the 25 points. The other one that's really the most important kind of falls outside of that, and it's it's what the actual reporting level was. And then we not only assess what that level of reporting was at the post-issuance stage, so it could be either nothing, UOP only, or UNP and impacts. Impacts only is very bad practice and very rare. I don't think we saw any issuer reporting only impacts this year. And then we also compare this to the commitment made at issuance. So if at issuance, the issuer planned to report use of proceeds and impacts, and then did so, that's the best case. That would score 7 points. The worst case is planning to report both use of proceeds and impacts at issuance, but then reporting none. So there we would penalize and just give 0 points. And that's essentially how we currently analyze the quality of reporting. It's not perfect. It's not a comprehensive methodology, at least yet, but it gives a decent indication of how good the reporting is. And we do this at issuer level. So for multiple bonds, we do the average for that issuer. And then there are a few other aspects that our quality scoring model does not yet consider. And so not all of those that form our best practice recommendations are currently included, but we may add more in the future. Some things are timeliness of reporting, for example, the ability to download or export data, whether supporting information is provided, again, becoming increasingly important. And then other specific bits which add granularity or clarity, such as providing a share of refinancing, providing the share of green bond financing within the project's overall investment or cost. And then also things specific on impacts, like whether ex post assessments are made or only ex ante impacts, whether multiple metrics are reported, etc. Now, I was initially planning to dive into a couple of best practice case studies examples. Again, we don't really have time, unfortunately, but the good news is our report has quite a lot of information on this. So on page 17, you can find a list of issuers that scored 24 or more points on our analysis and are very good indications of good reporting. And these cover different types of region and issuers. We also provide a list of the top 3 by issuer type. And so please check that. On page 14 and 15, you've also got several best practice case studies. So kind of more qualitative assessments of good reporting. And also, I should mention that those are the ones we analyze as part of our latest study, right? So there are, of course, other examples of good reporting out there. There are many other issuers with good reporting that we didn't analyze in the latest study. And actually, a good example is MuniFin, which they issued just before our cutoff and then just after. So actually, we didn't include them in the study this time. But they have excellent reporting. Karoliina will present in a moment. And then you can also check our previous report from 2019, which has other examples. Right, so that's it for me. Thank you very much for your attention. I've spoken for quite a while, so let's have a look at some questions from the audience. Hopefully I know how to answer them. Of course, if you have other feedback or other questions or recommendations or ideas, please get in touch with myself after the session. Right, so we've got one. How can impact be measured ex ante? Ex ante is just an expectation of impact. Is this acceptable for reporting? Okay, decent question. So the idea here is you've got ex ante impacts, which are calculated before the project or the impacts materialize, whereas ex post assessments are after the fact, right? So ex ante impacts are actually recommended under the Harmonized framework and as well as the NPSI position paper, but ex post assessments are said to be great when possible. The idea is that if you have ex ante impacts, they can already provide quite a good expectation of what the impact will be. And again, the key is for issuers to explain the methodology and to have a robust way of calculating that, potentially even to engage an external consultant. And as long as that methodology is clear, you can unpack it. You can say, okay, I don't agree with that, but at least the information is there. I would say that generally, from what I've seen, the ex ante calculation of impacts does not deviate that much usually from ex post assessments. So yeah, I would say that it's not perfect. We'd love to live in a world where everything is clear and the information is 100% reliable and calculated mathematically. For some impacts, also some metrics, it may not be possible, but it provides a very good indication usually. again, I can't stress enough that the key is to provide clarity. So clarifying your methodology really is what you need to do. Another question is the histogram of reporting scores. What issuers or bonds does this cover and what periods, right? So again, I didn't go into too much detail about the scope of our report because the information is all in the PDF. But essentially, we looked at, again, about 700 bonds from over 400 issuers, about 200 billion issued, was the market size covered. These were bonds issued between Q4 2017 and Q1 2019. So we did the analysis during the second half of 2020, and we wanted to allow over a year for the last issuers in that sample period to be able to report. So that's kind of what's covered, and yeah, that's essentially it. I mean, the issuers we did the analysis of quality were those that reported. If they didn't report, there was no point in doing it, right? So so that sample size within the ones analyzed for quality is a bit smaller. Okay. I am conscious of time. I would like to give the opportunity for other speakers to talk and to be able to answer questions. So I'm going to move on. Please, again, do get in touch with myself after the session. Otherwise, Karoliina, I will pass over to you.
Okay, thanks so much, Miguel and CBI. And thank you for the invitation to be in this panel today. Great to be here. And I'm happy to be talking about MuniFin's experience with impact reporting today. So for those of you who don't know MuniFin, we're a local government funding agency out of Finland, and we provide financing to the Finnish municipal sector as well as social housing. And indeed, my name is Karoliina Kajova, and I work in the funding team at MuniFin. Well then, let's kick off. So Miguel, can we go to slide 2, please? So that's the next slide. So just a bit of background. Our journey is on this slide. So we started our Green Bond program in 2016, and here you can see a timeline of our issuance. And a few years ago, we decided the time was ripe to start considering a social bond program too, to complement this green program we had in place. And we issued our first social bond last year as a consequence. And at the moment, we have 5 green bonds outstanding and 1 social bond. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Thanks, Miguel. So this year was actually the first year that we reported on the social bonds impact as well. And we decided to combine the reports for green and social this year. So we call these 2 bond programs jointly at MuniFin sustainable bonds. And the impact report was also called Sustainable Bond Impact Report as a consequence. But the report does have separate sections for green and social, and the impacts are completely separate. It's just the name that we like to use, which is sustainable bonds. Well then, let's go straight into business. So this is already something that Miguel touched upon earlier, but I just wanted to give an overview of our methodology towards impact reporting. And what we've tried to do is streamline our methodology between the 2 programs in place and match the general procedural aspects of reporting. So on this page, I've outlined the general reporting principles that apply to both bond programs, social and green, on the left-hand side. And then we have some specific reporting principles that apply to only one of the programs, more relating to the specific projects and impact calculations of each program. And just to highlight, our impact reporting has evolved over the years. And most recently, we have 2 additions, which I'd like to mention. So this was the first year we've reported on project level impacts. So before we were just reporting on the aggregate project level or kind of aggregate project category level impacts. And this year we went into one step deeper. So we showed a list of all the projects we have in our portfolio and their individual impacts. And this does bring a lot more transparency on this topic, and that is on the green and social side. And this year was also the first year that we published an Excel spreadsheet that contains the impacts on a project level, as well as a impact calculator that our investors can use to input their invested amount and see their share of the impacts that MuniFin has made with these bonds. So these are maybe the two newest developments that we have. And Miguel, maybe we can just delve a little bit more on this slide. Thanks. So I'd just like to highlight a few general reporting principles here. So to mention a few, we have a portfolio approach. So this suits our program better because we have a dynamic asset portfolio. So it would be quite difficult to then link bonds to specific projects as the loans are amortizing on the asset side. So we have gone with a portfolio approach on both green and social side. And we currently report on estimated ex-ante impacts. So exposed would be interesting, an interesting new avenue, but it would require a lot more resources, and it might also be difficult to get the data from our customer side, as we do as a credit institution rely on our customers for the impact data and for the accuracy of this data as well. And we do only report the impact based on the share that we have financed of the project's total finance, and we only report the impacts based on the outstanding amount of projects financed, so not the committed amount, which would include also a portion which has not yet been dispersed. And then some specific principles I have here on the right-hand side. So we have been an active player in the Nordic public sector issuers impact reporting recommendations that Miguel also mentioned earlier. And we have been following these recommendations on the green side, and many of these procedural methodologies have also been applied on the social side too. Though the social side would more strive to be in line with the ICMA social bond impact reporting recommendations, because there's, for example, impact indicators that are recommended there that we would use on the social side. But these recommendations are very similar on the procedural side. On the green bond side, we've actually used a consultancy firm to do the impact calculations, and this has assured that there was a third party involved, and this may also give more comfort on the results as the impacts are calculated by this third party expert who has kind of experience about these calculations. On the social side, we were able to prepare the report in-house. We've also relied on separate evaluation teams for both products to make final approval of projects, and we have received positive feedback on this feature. But in the future, we envisage that kind of as a result of the taxonomy and the GBS development, we'll most likely need to grow the in-house expertise and hire more colleagues to be more dedicated to green and social bond reports, as well as project selection. So we may do the calculations in-house going forward. Regarding kind of future enhancements, as a last thing, I wanted to mention that we are currently looking at when we could report on the taxonomy alignment of our green project portfolio. At present, we are analyzing how these new regulations, green bond standard and taxonomy, will affect our green bond program. And would very much like to be EU GBS aligned. However, this analysis is still ongoing and can't say for sure, but we will most likely add some reporting on taxonomy alignment to going forward into our impact reporting. Well then, let's go into the indicators. So on the next two slides, I have listed which impact indicators or impact metrics, as they're also called, we use in both of our programs. So let's start with the green side. So we have 5 categories in our green program where we have projects in currently. And these impact indicators here are presented so for each category. And these indicators are based on the Nordic position paper for the most part, with the water and wastewater management category, where is a bit of an exception, where we've adapted the indicators more specifically to our projects. For the public transportation category, the impacts are based on calculations done in project plans for the project. For example, the Western Metro expansion, rather than doing calculation based on data from our customers. Well, then I'd like to talk about one category and its indicators in detail. So I'll take buildings, and specifically new buildings. So we report two indicators here. Annual energy savings, which is then divided more granularly into two subcategories, which is avoided or reduced. And there's actually a small mistake on the slide. So these avoided and reduced should actually be in parentheses, as those are indeed subcategories of savings. And for new buildings, these are megawatt hours avoided indeed, and not reduced, as we're looking at a baseline. And then we also report another indicator called annual CO2 emissions avoided or reduced in tons of CO2. And again, for new buildings, that would be avoided. And these tons of CO2 emissions, we call it kind of CO2 emissions avoided or reduced because we only have CO2 emissions from the projects and no other greenhouse gas emissions that we have gauged. But I'm aware that many in the market use tons of CO2 equivalent, so kind of to account for any other greenhouse gas emissions. And so in the future, we may align and match with other issuers to change the name to tons of CO2 equivalent, but the content would basically not change, it's just the name. And then to just show quick calculation how we would calculate these then. So we look at the difference in energy consumption between a baseline reference building and the new building that's being built, and the baseline scenario is basically a reference building that's been constructed in accordance with the applicable building regulations in Finland. And then the energy that avoided that we get from this calculation would then be converted to CO2 emissions avoided using emission factors for electricity and heating. And it would also be weighted with MuniFin's share of the total finance. Let's then move on to social side. So talk about those indicators, and please do read through these and also read our report. It has a lot more information on all of these and all the different indicators, how we calculate them. So for social, we have three categories. And we have currently reported on outputs, and we don't have data to be able to report on outcomes and impacts on the social side. So unlike in green, outcome and impact data is not available ex ante for social. The social projects are also still in building phase in our portfolio, so we don't have ex post analysis at hand either at this stage. Also, it would be difficult to get ex post data on outcomes and impacts on the social side. For example, in the social housing category, currently data is not collected at our customers' end on people living on in social housing buildings, for example. So it could also be a data challenge. However, we do always analyze our reports annually, and we are always looking for ways to improve them. So let's see if it's possible to report at some stage on outcomes and impacts on the social side too. And I wanted here to take one category again, like on the green side, and talk about its indicators. So let's look at the social housing category. So there we report two indicators, number of residents and number of apartments for the most vulnerable population. And we also mention for all projects, the target population of the project. For all current projects, the target population are the most vulnerable population, for example, elderly people or immigrants. And we also report for each project the social goals or challenges that the project strives to tackle. So for social housing, these would include, for example, equality, communality, or kind of safety, to mention a few. And these are all defined in the report, what these social goals would be. Well, And to finish off, on this last slide, I wanted to maybe talk a little bit about what we've learned so far, and I've listed a few bullet points here. So on the framework, when setting up the framework, it makes sense to consider the reporting in quite detail. For example, which indicators you're going to be showing in your reports, because this links with data and availability of the data. So you have the data. You need to kind of make sure that you have the data to calculate and present the impacts. As mentioned before, for example, we're reliant on our customers' data as they are project owners. So take this into account when you're setting up your framework. Another recommendation would be to collect project information as early as possible upon approval, if possible, of those projects. So just to make sure that you have the data when you're compiling the report around year end or in January when it's busy anyway. Also, it makes sense to develop internal systems as much as possible, so you have central software for all the data rather than the files being in different locations or in Excels, for example. And regarding the choice of methods and baselines, I want to stress that it's important to explain those and expand on them in the report, so it's clear to the reader. The methods may be dependent on data, being available. So it's good to harmonize, but sometimes harmonization is not possible. And especially then, it's important to explain why you've chosen certain baselines or certain methods and show them in the report so the reader understands this. In terms of internal resources, so this is quite a time-consuming and resource-heavy impact reporting, but you can collaborate with many different departments on this, and that's the great part. So it enables us to have even deeper cooperation internally. So you take up resources, but you get also a lot from impact reporting. And as a final point, I just wanted to highlight the importance of collaboration with market participants. So do seek out expertise, be open to feedback, kind of developing your report. Reporting just doesn't stay the same from year to year. We've noticed that. And the market evolves. So for example, now, you have the taxonomy. So it brings there is more standardization and it brings changes to your reporting as well, and we feel it's been great to collaborate with other Nordics, for example, on this point. And then maybe the last bit to do some marketing. So please do visit our website. The last page shows some links there, and you'll find the Nordic position paper also on our website, as well as on the website of all the other issuers that have been involved there. And thanks so much for listening in today.
Great, thanks so much, Karoliina. There's a question here, which is, thanks for being open about challenges concerning data related to social impacts. Is it openly accepted that social bonds will have lower returns, but maybe high on values, and that investors are ready or informed about this? I'm actually not sure on the meaning of this one.
Yeah.
Are they able to clarify %? Well, I think
was there any clarification?
No, there isn't. But
yeah.
What's probably best. So I realize we're running a little bit over time. I think we'll probably have to cut the Q&A bits a little bit short, because it's great to get the detail from the speakers. And do get in touch with me if there's anything you want to clarify, and I'll put you in touch as relevant.
Sounds good, and we're always happy to discuss these bilaterally or so. Do reach out and let's discuss.
Great, thanks so much, Karoliina.
Thank you.
Well, with that, I'll hand over to Daniel Kricheff from Affirmative Investment Management. Very much looking forward to your presentation. Thanks, Daniel.
Great, thank you very much, Miguel, and to the participants as well for speaking with us today. It's very interesting, and I think very, very important topic that we're discussing here today. As Miguel mentioned, I'm Daniel Kricheff with Affirmative Investment Management, and I'm going to talk to you today about sort of two sort of broad areas. The first is our process as a consumer of impact data, that is, as an asset manager, we spend quite a bit of time actually looking through these reports and engaging in a constructive and sometimes critical way as well with green bond issuers about how impact data is reported. Secondly, I think I'm just going to talk a little bit as much as time permits about some sort of general recommendations or if you will, polite requests that as an asset manager or an investor that we have from impact bond issuers. And I think some of these will be mirror to, I think, in less detail, the recommendations that Miguel provided already during his presentation. So Miguel, if you go to the next slide, thank you. And so just a quick brief overview. We are an affirmative investment management fixed income impact investor. And so that's, our purpose really is to deliver mainstream fixed income returns, but do so while generating environmental and social impact. Our strategy is currently focused to a large extent on labeled use of proceeds bonds, so the green, social, and sustainability bond market. And we were an early player in this space, and we continue to engage closely with the market. Our process overall is really based on research-driven verification of bond frameworks and issuers, and also on an annual bottom-up impact reporting process. And in both instances, we engage closely with bond issuers, and we do, as I mentioned, read impact reports in a close manner. So impact reporting is an important part of our process and what we offer to our clients. And as you can see in here, we've received some awards through the years, for that process. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit at a high level some of the impact highlights from our reporting for 2020, which we've just recently wrapped up actually over the summer. I think the first thing is just to show that we have we do have a relatively high coverage ratio, weighted coverage ratio for our portfolios of around 90%, depends on the fund. And this is really based on bottom-up reporting using issuer reports and engaging with issuers as well to get the most granular information that we can. And of course, this coverage ratio is in some respects a reflection of the fact that our portfolios are constructed largely actually of use of proceeds bonds, but also of the the level of work that we put into the process of collecting and aggregating data, which I think was referred to in the previous presentation as well. The amount of work that is actually involved in this. We do also, in some instances, we calculate our own metrics, particularly around climate metrics. For example, we calculate our own weighted emissions. And I think it's also important to say that while we do calculate, we apply our own methodology to calculate avoided emissions, we do rely quite heavily actually on issuer reports, use of proceeds reports and allocation reports to allow us to drive those metrics ourselves. And one of the reasons why we do that actually is because it's the challenge of actually harmonizing across different avoided emissions calculated using different methodologies or without a great deal of transparency around how they were calculated. So we use a methodology which is called carbon yield, which we actually developed together with ISS ESG and Lions Head with funding from Rockefeller a few years back. And if anybody's interested in that, actually it's free to use. It's available online. And we do a couple of other things as well. For example, we calculate our own weighted average carbon intensity. We've done some research on sector contribution to the WACC within our portfolios. And we also do for the second year actually running, we've done a physical climate risk assessment of projects funded by green bonds within our portfolio. So again, actually relying quite heavily on issuer reports and particularly project level issuer reports to allow us to do scenario analysis to assess how specific assets or projects may be affected by climate change going forward. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thanks. And just over here on this slide, I've got some of the sort of headline metrics. These are aggregated across all of our funds for this year. And just, at the top row, as you can see, we have our climate-related metrics, which we've done using our in-house methodology, but again, these are actually based on use of proceeds impact reports from issuers. In the middle row, you'll see three sort of selected metrics from a number that we do report on, but these actually, in this case, come directly from KPIs or metrics reported by issuers themselves, which we prorate and aggregate at the fund level. These are some of the standard ones that you'd say. We provide some sort of context to show what it's an equivalent to make sense, of some of these KPIs that may not be as clear to people without specialist knowledge. And just at the bottom row, I've highlighted 3 data points, which I think just to give you a sense of the scale, actually, of this exercise that we go through on an annual basis. This year, for 2020, we looked at 139 impact bond frameworks, some of which would have multiple securities underneath them, but that's just at the framework level. And from that, we were able to report on over 2,700 specific projects or initiatives across 166 countries. And across all of our funds and weighted by average weights, we achieved an 89% coverage ratio. That will vary depending on the fund. So this is weighted across all of our holdings. And I think those figures, I think, really give you a sense of the scale and the challenge of doing this. And I think really bring home the importance of the points that Miguel made in his presentation about moving the market or the space forward so that metrics are harmonized, metrics are reported in standardized and clear ways, which I'll talk a little bit about if time permits. If you go to the next slide, please. I just talk a little bit briefly, actually, about how we go through the process of essentially claiming our share of impact or a particular portfolio's share of impact. And the process really starts, of course, with the reports and KPIs that are provided to us by issuers, either through their reports or through a process of engagement. And the first step of the process is really about actually calculating the bond share of the impact that's reported. In many cases, this is a pretty easy process. If the total cost of a project is covered by the bond itself, through bond allocations, it's not a problem. But in many cases, of course, it's a more complicated process. And it's we go through a process of ensuring that the KPIs that we're integrating into our reports are prorated correctly according to the share that the bond itself can claim for that KPI. The second step is, of course, just prorating it based on our holdings, which is a fairly simple process. And then the final step is actually just aligning KPIs and units and then aggregating them together to get those portfolio level or those fund level metric portfolio impacts that we report upon. So if you go to the next slide, please. And these are just, in this slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the themes or key topics, I think, that are important in terms of our process. And I think the first one is really just about process integration, just about integrating this into your overall processes, whether that's through your research on issuers and frameworks itself, making sure that the impact reporting is not done in a silo. The second point, I think, is really actually, in some respect, one of the most important, which is really just about effective data management. And I think this applies both to issuers and also to investors and asset managers that, this data these are very large data sets, very complex, and the issuer reporting may not always align with investor needs. So it's important that you get your data management processes, in place before you begin the process. And we actually have our own proprietary database in which we keep all this information. It actually performs many of the calculations that we use to prorate KPIs before we report on them. The third here is just about transparency, and I think this was touched on by other speakers today, but really about the importance of granular reporting at the most granular level possible. And obviously there are many cases where project impacts are not possible to report upon, but if it is possible, that is really the level at which we should be aiming to report. Second is methodological consistency. And for us, this is the challenge of really harmonizing and aligning metrics and selecting cases where we actually have to do our own calculations to ensure that we're doing it in a rigorous and the best possible, to the best possible way. As I mentioned, we do our own emissions data. And finally, I think this was also mentioned in the previous presentation, really about engagement. And this is, I think ultimately we're working towards the same thing here. And I think having conversation and open channel of communication to ensure that we get the information that we need, and also that we can provide feedback to issuers so they know how to give us what we're looking for. So if you could move to the next slide. And I'm aware that I don't want to go over the allotted time that I've been given today, but I just want to repeat some of the sort of recommendations that I think these align pretty closely with what Miguel talked about. That these are recommendations that we'd give to bond issuers themselves. And the first is about metric selection, and really making sure that you choose indicators that are the most material and relevant to the project itself, and to the extent possible, ensuring that you're reporting with like KPIs or metrics that are aligned with other market participants, so that those indicators can be actually aggregated by asset managers, by investors like ourselves. The second is a recommendation around project level reporting, if possible. And then really about actually aligning allocation reporting across all the various areas that you're reporting in. So whether it's project or geography or KPI, ensuring that those are clear, so that we say, well, if you say we achieved this level of impact across these 5 geographies, ensuring that we can determine where those impacts are coming from in a geographical sense. A third is really about baselines, methodologies, just publish as much information as possible, and make that and do it in a transparent way. And this applies not just to climate metrics, but even to sort of more less seemingly complex things. For example, beneficiaries or jobs created can often be somewhat opaque in terms of what that means. So allowing us to make a judgment call as to what's relevant for our own reporting processes. Again, I talked quite a bit about project size versus issuer share, and this is recommended by ICMA, and I think this should really be standard practice across the industry. And finally, I think this final point actually speaks a little bit more to those involved in aggregating or collecting impact reports, and either commoditizing them or making them available in a public database, which is really about providing links to source materials, so that we can see where that information is coming from. And also maintaining, public database of historical reporting as well, so that investors can see how reporting may have changed over time for various issuers. And that's it. I think I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Daniel, and it's really great to hear the perspective from your side, and quite a bit of detail you were able to share there, and it's good to hear also that very much in line with the other guidance and also our recommendations. I'm going to move on to the next presentation by Isobel from Investment Partners. Again, we will try to answer a couple more questions that we've come through at the end if there's time, but otherwise just have to get in touch with speakers. Apologies about that. So Isobel, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel. So, we've had a lot of great advice on how to, make your reporting as effective as possible. And then I'm going to focus a little bit on the EU taxonomy and how that works into your reporting and making your reporting EU taxonomy ready. Next slide, please. So for those who aren't familiar with the EU Green Bond Standard, I imagine there are quite a few familiar with this, but we'll go over it anyway. It's 4 parts. So the first is the publication of your Green Bond Framework, which includes alignment with the EU taxonomy in the framework pre-issuance. The second part is the annual allocation reports, the final allocation report, and also the impact report. The allocation report and the impact report can be provided separately or combined. We often see them combined in the market, but you are free to do either. Next slide, please. So there is some guidance in the EU Green Bond Standard about allocation reporting and impact reporting. And they're encouraged to use the reporting templates that are provided in that standard. So you can see that the reporting should include a statement that the green bond is still aligned with the EU green bond standard as referenced in the green bond framework that was issued pre-issuance. And then the scope and approach of reporting should also be included, as well as the breakdown of the activities. And if you see on the next slide, also the geographical location of the activities. Can we have the next slide, please? Great. So the geographical distribution of the green projects as well. And then you should also include the environmental objectives and the environmental impact using the metrics and thresholds as described pre-issuance in the green bond framework. So there should be consistency pre-issuance and post-issuance. And it should also be transparent what methodology and assumptions you are using in the impact assessment and impact reporting as well. Next slide. So then allocation reports should be published at least annually until full allocation. And then the final allocation report should be verified, but the impact report is just recommended to be verified. So if you're providing a combined allocation and impact report, then that should be verified. If you're doing them separately, then just consider that guidance. If you've been following the green bond market for a while, you'll see that these requirements aren't very different to what was already in place under the green bond principles and what issuers were already doing. The big changes here are the EU taxonomy alignment, and the verifiers also have to go through a different process now. But this should be a pretty familiar process for those who have already been in the market for a while. Next slide. Next slide, thanks. So at NNIP, we've been going through our portfolios and we've been going through each bond in our green bond fund and getting the alignment to the EU taxonomy for each bond. So the way we've been doing this, we've been going into the impact report of each bond in our portfolio. We've been going through all the activities that are listed out in the allocation and impact reports. And we've been assessing those against the EU taxonomy. So then we've come out with different percentages for all of those bonds. And we've done that either if it's just one or two types of activities, then we're able to do that from the framework. But if there's many different activities, we really do need the allocation, if it's combined allocation and impact report or the allocation report in order to do that. So that type of reporting is going to be critically important for the EU taxonomy alignment for investors. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to show you an example of how we would lay out an assessment of the EU taxonomy for a bond in our portfolio. And so you can see sort of what type of information we're trying to get from that allocation and impact report. So we would first need to know what activities are in the bond itself. So if you can map those activities to the exact name of the activity in the EU taxonomy, that is very useful, because otherwise we have to do that mapping ourselves, which involves, taking the description of the activity and us going through the annexes and trying to map that, which takes a little bit of time. And then secondly, once you have those categories already identified, if it was possible, it would be great if you could confirm that these are still aligned with the EU taxonomy, and even better if you can include what thresholds you've used to determine the alignment. Otherwise, we can do that from our side as well. Next slide, please. So you don't actually need to read this. This is just a screenshot of the do no significant harm assessments. You'll know these are quite lengthy and quite complicated. And for EU issuers, this is a little bit easier to do, because for EU projects, there are some do no significant harm criteria that are automatically eligible, such as the environmental impact assessments that are required under already existing EU directives. So if you have EU projects, then there's a chance that quite a few of these will pass automatically. But if you are able to provide any extra non-automatic alignments within the allocation and impact report, that is also incredibly useful for the do no significant harm assessment from our side as well. Next slide, please. And then the minimum social safeguards. So there are various different social safeguards that have been mentioned within the EU taxonomy. And these, they've listed out the ILO, they've listed out UN Global Compact and the OECD requirements. And so if you can, even if it's obvious, even if you've already included it in your sustainability reporting, in your CSR reporting, it's also good to put this here so that it's all in one place. We don't have to keep searching in various different reports for that information. Next slide, please. So then at the end, it should be pretty easy for us because we've already got the categories, we've already got the alignment to the taxonomy, we've got the social safeguards all listed in the same place in the same document, and we can very quickly calculate whether there's any components missing and go back to the issuer, or we can deem it to be 100% aligned and put that as 100 into our database. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give a few examples of some issuer reporting that I've seen on the market lately, and we're going to go through some pros and cons, but this isn't to, call out any particular issuer. It's just to share information and, show what's kind of most useful from our side when considering the EU taxonomy. So here you can see that the way it's been listed out, it's onshore wind, solar photovoltaic, and they've listed out the location as well. And this is incredibly useful to map that to the EU taxonomy categories. However, they've done installed capacity attributable to the bond as the way to list out the allocation. It's even more useful if we can have the allocation amount as the way that they differentiate between the projects. But this is still a good example of an easily mappable EU taxonomy report. Next slide. So here, this is more difficult for us to use for an EU taxonomy alignment. We were actually not able to do much with this, unfortunately. So you can see here the categories on the left-hand side. If you look under reporting date, you can see this left-hand column has renewable energy, energy efficiency, efficient buildings, waste management, clean transportation. Under renewable energy, you can have various different energies. You can have various different clean transportation categories, various different types of waste management activity. We can't do anything with this report, unfortunately, for the EU taxonomy. So it's a shame because I'm sure the information is available somewhere, but it would be great if this could be included in the impact report so that we can map that to the taxonomy. Next slide, please. And here you'll see this is another example of, it looks very nice. Obviously, a lot of effort has gone into the branding of this impact report. You can see here, if you look on the bottom left-hand box, we've got decarbonization, packaging, and water. These are the three categories here. These are even more vague than the categories in the last example that we saw. So again, we can't map that to anything. This is even less clear what this refers to. And we weren't able to include any kind of EU taxonomy alignment for this bond, which is a shame because some of these are probably more aligned in reality if we could get that information. But based off of these impact reports, we do have to give it 0% alignment. So for the next impact reports from these issuers, we do hope to see a detailed breakdown exactly of what is in those categories. Next slide, please. So the key takeaways here are mapping the bond categories to the EU taxonomy categories. That takes quite a lot of time, and it is great if that is already done from the issuer side. Clear financial allocation amounts, not installed capacity or any kind of other allocations. The financial allocation is the most useful for us. The geographical locations of the projects as well. Mixed categories cannot be used, unfortunately, so those do need to be broken down into individual activities. I know that can take quite a lot of time if impact reporting was done previously in a different way, but unfortunately, things are moving forward now and we do need more detailed information. And then if you're doing them separately, if you're doing allocation report and impact report, then make sure that allocation report is verified. And then the impact reports should include the same environmental objectives stated in the framework pre-issuance with the methodology publicly available and transparent. So happy to take any questions, but I know we're running a little bit over time, so do get in contact with me if we don't have time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isobel. It's hopefully issuers will start providing information a bit more. I'm sure compared to last year, you get a little bit more detail than that you need than compared to before. I will now move on to the Green Assets Wallet. Just going to stop sharing my screen so that our comms team can take over for these two last ones. And we've got very useful demos that you don't see every day from the Green Assets Wallet and Green Bond Transparency platform. I'm sure they'll be really useful, and looking forward.
Thanks, Miguel. Is someone showing my slides?
Comms, are you? No. Okay. Well, I will. No. All right. I will share screen in this case. Go ahead, Cecilia. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. And thanks so much for inviting us to speak at this very important topic that's obviously very close to our heart. And it was really great to hear from Karoliina, Daniel, and Isobel on their perspectives. So my name is Cecilia Repinski. I'm the CEO of the Green Assets Wallet, and this is a global trust platform aimed at accelerating impact finance, focusing on the labeled bond market. And I've been personally working in this space for almost 20 years, and this is what really led me to technology and how technology can work as a lever to accelerate sustainable finance, and that is why the Green Assets Wallet was created. So next slide, please, Miguel. So before I start explaining what we do, we are a purpose-driven initiative. So I think what's really important to understand is why, because everything we do starts with a why. And obviously everyone here is aware that private investment is instrumental for the transition. But this is really the way we perceive the future truth that we need to see. So the way we think about capital is basically you have water in a bucket, and we're standing in our Garden of Eden choosing which water to plant, which plants to water. And if we choose to water the weeds, we will live in a garden of weed. And if we choose to water the lemon and the fruits and flowers, we will have our Garden of Eden, basically. So in the future, and the future we strive to manifest, is one where the easiest route for the water is to basically build prosperous and sustainable societies on Earth. And our job as a platform is to create that infrastructure that enables capital to very practically consider this to be the easier route. So next slide, please. So the Green Assets Wallet, it's a global trust platform created and designed specifically to scale sustainable finance with measurable impact by injecting efficiency and transparency into the green debt market. And our starting point is the label bond market, and the development of this platform has been very much a cross-sector collaboration between green finance experts, tech innovators, capital market actors. We have brought on board very different perspectives, all discussing how technology can be put to serve sustainable finance. And obviously we have this amazing momentum in the finance sector, where we have a lot of actors generating sustainable assets, such as label bonds, and we have demand side actors from investors. And there is a clear commitment from both sides to step up and deliver real world impact to succeed with the transition. But at the same time, capital reallocations in relation to the overall market size is quite limited. So we have a lot of needs or impact investment opportunities in, for example, emerging markets among SMEs, etc., that remain unfinanced. So to sum this up, demand is still growing faster than the supply of investable assets. And at the same time, we have investor requirements for demonstrated credibility and credible impact that is increasing. And that leaves us with a situation where the market wants to grow beyond its current scope into more actors, sectors, regions, and players, but it will only be able to grow in those directions through demonstrated trust and transparency. And that's where we come in. And as a tech company, you always get the question of what it is that you want to disrupt. Well, we see a clear risk for a trade-off between the ability to confirm credibility and the ability to scale the market. And that's basically the trade-off that we intend to disrupt. So our job is to establish trust, to grow the market, and using data to use that trust, to establish that trust. So we can make it very easy for investors to access and confirm credible green investment opportunities, and easy for issuers to demonstrate transparency and credible impact to access capital. So when it comes to investors, basically we provide them with trusted data to inform allocation choices and also to enable correct evaluation of their investments. So as an investor, you get direct access to quantifiable impact data according to best-in-class indicators and metrics that enable benchmarking and comparability and aggregation. So investors save significant time and can make new investment discoveries, and can also benefit from third-party post-issuance verification services and other types of verification to trust the data. Next slide, please. And as an issuer with the Green Assets Wallet, you're able to demonstrate credibility and showcase impact achievements to investors through a user-friendly tool, so that you can convey data to the market in the best possible way. And with this high level of transparency, the Green Assets Wallet works as a knowledge transfer platform for new actors who are new to the market in terms of getting it right. And we're also able to encourage best practice and reward transparency, which is really the most important foundation for trust between investors and issuers. There's also a third group that the Green Assets Wallet is designed for, and that's validators, such as second opinion institutes, NGOs, research bodies, etc. Anyone who is fit to confirm credibility, no harm, and verify measurable impact. And this fall, we are actually going to focus our efforts more on you, because we think that these kinds of third-party validators is very much needed to build this level of trust that we need, so that we can steer capital in the right direction. So please consider this an invitation to collaborate with us. Next slide, please. For the sake of time, I'm going to move into the demo instead of focusing on the services, but this is just for reference when we share the slides afterwards. So next slide, please. So in terms of who's on the Green Assets Wallet, we do still have a tilt towards Europe, but I do want to make it perfectly clear that we are a market neutral platform, and we're here to support all issuers and investors regardless of sector or geography. And we also find that it's really our job to make sure that we can make it very easy for issuers to report to the market in the best possible way. And some issuers have great resources on board. Some new issuers might need a little bit of extra support, and that's really what we're here for. So please, next slide, please. So do reach out to our team if there's anything that we can do to help you and to make it very easy and smooth to report on your impact to the market. And with that, I think I will move into doing a demonstration of the platform. So let's see here. So right now, I am logged into the Green Assets Wallet as an investor, and I can see a lot of different issuers here on the platform, and choose between them and search by name or by any other. For example, I could search for MuniFin. We just heard Karoliina's excellent presentation, and we can see that this is a profile that's verified and managed by the issuer. We can see when they made the latest changes, for example, when the latest impact was reported, etc. I can also search for bonds and go into this section and see different bonds that I want to discover, maybe SDGs, maybe there's a certain, for example, a taxonomy. I want to see which bonds are aligned with the taxonomy, etc. And going back to issuers, if you want to look at, for example, some of the impact data, we can go to this issuer, for example, Kommunalbanken in Norway. And the issuers that I show here, we have checked with them beforehand for information. So here we can see we have an overview, we have the bonds, we have some projects here, and we can see what the green objectives are, etc. And we can see the different use of proceeds, the frameworks, the second opinion, everything is gathered into one place, including the SDGs. And here we go down into the quantifiable impact data. We do align with Nordic Public Position Paper and ICMA to make sure that we work with best practice. But there's also the opportunity for issuers to provide custom indicators and report on things that may fall outside. But we do nudge everyone who uses the platform to report according to these indicators and units, structured according to these user proceeds, because that enables investors to access the information that enables them to compare and make aggregations, etc. So what's also interesting here is that even though we have this platform for conveying impact data in a structured format and in the same KPIs, the methodologies, and I think several of the speakers picked up on this, may differ. And for us, this is really our job to make sure that it's very clear and transparent how these numbers were generated, but also doing so in a way that doesn't take too much time from either side, not from the issuer or from the investors, because one can't expect, I mean, we have very ambitious investors speaking here today, but a lot of investors find it very tiresome to read through all these impact reports and try to locate what the methodology behind it was. So, for example, I can show here that every time this indicator appears, annual greenhouse gas emissions reduced or avoided, issuers have the opportunity to report on the average grid factor used. And this is just a very easy way to provide a kind of level of transparency for how the numbers have been calculated. And it's very easy for an investor to understand where this comes from. At the same time, we talked about bond share here. Again, if issuers do it differently, some take away everything else, for example, a debt portfolio, to only report 100% on what's in the bond, and some report on everything, providing sort of an opportunity for a tap bond, etc. Our job is just to make it very crystal clear what's what and support issuers with reporting on this in the best possible way. There's also the opportunity to report on projects, and we have some projects here, for example. We also have a big project database here of all the different projects and use cases on the Green Assets Wallet. This is a very nice combination to the quantifiable hardcore impact data to provide stories about what it is that the user proceeds were being used for. So we have, for example, a project here about smart transportation and using digitalization. There's another project. This is a village that relies only on locally produced renewable energy for some time of the year, etc. When it comes to projects, one can also search for projects if one is interested in a specific type of impact edge or really interesting cases. One can search by region, for example. We can look at what's in North America. We can see what's in North America. We can search for example, Asia. We can go into this project, which is renewable energy in Malaysia. What's interesting about this project is that it's a case where we have third-party validation. Now, third-party validation can happen in many different ways. And in this particular case, we help the issuer provide validation with a third party through remote sensing that basically confirms solar panels on this geographic location, and also the before and after of the effects on the surrounding forest cover, for example. One can also search for projects when it comes to specific categories, for example, land use, and we can find some projects that way. And we can also find impact reporting at the project level that we discussed earlier. So as an investor, I can go to my assets and I can look at different types of portfolios and their allocation, and I can construct impact reports directly on the platform. So for example, let's say I want to make an impact report of this particular fund, and I name it, for example, CBI 2020. I choose a year for this. I provide some sort of description to this. I choose which statistics I would like to include, which indicators I would like to involve in here. If I would like to have some project case studies, maybe I want to add this, some use cases, and what kind of reporting I would like to demonstrate. So this is a functionality that is still in a beta mode, but we're on the live platform. So our investors are testing this with us now to provide some input in terms of how we finalize this. But it's basically a way for us to give investors opportunities to slice and dice the data in different ways on the platform. And here, this is the impact assigned from this particular allocation of this fund. And below here, I have some interesting use cases for this investment.
Cecilia, a lot of useful info. I think we'll probably have to move on to Alex just to give him enough time. If that's okay with you. Thank you very much, though.
Thank you so much.
Cheers. I actually hadn't seen it, so that's fantastic to see. And of course, when the goal is to provide clarity, then it's good to have a platform that does that too. So Alex, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Also, thanks Cecilia, thank you Daniel, Karoliina, and Isobel. Actually, everybody who spoke before gave the whole reasoning why we developed the platform. And in 2016, we started our green bond program for Latin America. We started first supporting national development banks and later sovereigns to issue green bonds. And we faced many of the challenges that were spoken about from the pre-issuance to the post-issuance elements. In 2019, together with the Climate Bonds Initiative, we supported the survey for a global survey and then a Latin American survey for post-issuance reporting in Latin America. And we saw that while issuers had the data, they were not reporting accordingly. And we developed the Green Bond Transparency Platform to allow the issuers to show better the data that they have. Investors choose bonds based on that data, or support them to make the decisions. Regulators to make fact-based decisions, and evaluators support the markets through showing what they have actually reviewed. So if we can go to the next slide, the work that we have done since 2016 is to support about 30%, not only of the green, but also of the sustainable capital market in Latin America. It's quite small, but each of these is one or multiple issuances with different issuers. And that's where our experience actually comes from. Please, next slide. So the platform combines basically several stakeholder interests. There are more than these. There's also the civil society and academia. But what we want to promote is the comparability, transferability, traceability, and the completeness of data. And this in terms of individual bonds, portfolio approaches for impact and use of proceeds. Next slide, please. We worked from the beginning, and that was basically fall 2019 with different market actors from AIM. Daniel is here, so it's not surprising that some of the ideas we actually have implemented come directly from these partners. We have issuers, investment banks, external reviewers, from the very beginning who have supported us in showing, okay, how is their work going with each of the issuers. We have different platforms that we collaborate with in data sharing and nomenclature harmonization, which is NASDAQ and Luxembourg Stock Exchange. We're very happy to also collaborate with Cecilia, who has been also a pioneer in this field. Please, next slide. So here's something that before I go to the platform demo, I would like to explain very briefly is that, and confirm, all of the data on the platform is from issuers. The IADB nor the Green Bond Transparency Platform does not any interpretation of the data. The only thing that we do is we provide the platform as a means to provide standardized reporting and comparable reporting. We provide this for investors, for academics, for civil society, for regulators. All of the data is free of charge downloadable. Nobody that wants just to look at the data needs to sign in. So as you see the platform in a couple of minutes, everybody can see it and download the data in Excel completely. Basically, something that we have created, that's the second step. We have created Excel sheets to facilitate the upload rather than a web form. So there are three. One is the individual projects. The second is the allocation and disbursement. And the third is for the KPIs, which is then linked to each of the projects. The bond is created, the Excels are uploaded, and in the second step, an external review is requested, which is then inputted by the external reviewer. Next slide, please. And I think that this is already where my presentation starts. It says that I cannot start now. Okay. So as you enter the Green Bond Transparency Platform, you see high-level overview page. We currently have 87 bonds, about 40 issuers. That means that about every 3 days, an issuer has entered the platform since we started, launched the platform in April of this year. We have currently a coverage of $17 billion in issued bonds, and about 1/3 of those have reported already proceeds and impacts. As an aggregate, about 25 million tons of CO2 have been reduced by these issuers. That only means that's the share that has been reported within that. When you see here, we have about 560 projects covered for this total volume of reported 6.9 billion. And the feature that you see here is the green bond principles, the climate bond standard, the project classification, to be more exact, the EU green bond standard, which is something that is currently implemented. As Isobel mentioned, it's quite close, but not the same as existing standards. There are some additional issues like do no significant harm and ISO 14030. What this means is when you switch between these two, is that we have asked each issuer to upload the project classification in both GBP and CBI to make comparisons more simple. This means that even bonds that have not been CBI certified are currently reporting according to at least two nomenclatures. When you go into the filter page, so to speak, you can quite simply tag. This is a standard by where issuer location, by the issuer type. We distinguish according to standard terms between development banks, financial corporates, non-financial corporates, local governments, and sovereigns. As mentioned, we apply actually all taxonomies that are currently in the market that are relevant for Latin America, and by actually choosing the different you can choose basically the different individual project categories that that you're looking for. Let me return to that. So if you see here, these are the within that. Well, you can go by currency, obviously, indicators. Here we have a bit of distinction between us and different platforms, is that we use the indicators that the issuer themselves has committed to. So we are not changing any of these. We can aggregate those, but we allow each issuer to pick their own. I would like to move on, basically showing a couple of individual bonds. Again, without endorsing any of these, we are also not a platform for investment advice, but we hope that this information will be useful. So when we look at the Klabin bond, we see here that Klabin has offered to the public the individual location data, very basic data, which is when the bond was issued, for how much, and how much has been dispersed already. And the disbursement data is shown together with its original allocation, according to the different to the different sub-project activities, which is also something that will be useful for GBS reporting. When we go to KPIs, one thing that I think could be interesting to show is that here it's obviously shown from when to when this KPI was reported upon. I'll go on just to show that we really support also very small issuers. This one, Attend, has issued for 13 million, so it's a very small issuer. We have even smaller issuers, and through our system, we were able to allow them to report very granularly through the Excel sheets that we provided. This is Suzano, which again, here you can see that there is a reporting which spans 2 years, whether afterwards they started to report for each year. Going on, this is an issuer, Grupo Bancolombia, where you see some of the aspects that were discussed before. What happens if you do not want the name of the project to appear? You can still report and provide information on the data. Going on, this is Chile, one of our most important issuers in the market also. And you can see here, basically based on each subcategory, how much was issued, dispersed actually. Here, this is Kpis, one example of a supranational development bank. Similarly, we supported them to upload their data. FIRA, yes, so sorry, I think I have to wrap up. I have to stop you. Yeah, no problem. Well, the only message that I have is that we have about 5 to 7 calls per day to explain the platform to issuers. We have a very dedicated team. So if there are any questions, please come back to us. Sure. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Great to see the platform coming alive. If you could stop sharing screen, I'll just move on to our last slide. Thank you. Right, well, that's essentially it for today. I'd like to really thank all the speakers. We've got a few closing remarks. I'm not sure we have time to go over this, but it's everything that's already been included. The presentation will be shared as mentioned, and please do get in touch with either myself or the speakers. I can put you in touch with them. So I really do hope you found the session useful. Again, thank you to everyone. And next up, again, thank you to our sponsors. Next up, we have a session on certification and assurance with our certification team. So tune into that one too. Otherwise, I wish you the rest of a good day and have a great week at our conference.